Okay, so I think we're rolling. Um, Here we go. Welcome everyone to another episode of Sapiens Playground. I'm here with a big guest today. I think we've all been waiting for Dr. Shawn Baker. Welcome to the show. How are you today?
I am doing well. Thank you very much for having me, and Guten Tag, and hopefully everything's going well with you in Germany.
Right. Yeah, that's awesome. Like I really appreciate you coming on because it's difficult to reach out to people who are so popular in our space. And so it's really cool to be able to talk to you because I've been listening to lots of your stuff, and I have seen you on many different podcast platforms, speaking to all kinds of people. And so it's really cool to have a talk to you today. So
Yeah, my pleasure. Happy to be here.
awesome. So let's maybe start off with you introducing yourself. Just maybe tell people who you are in case they still are not familiar with who you are and what your background is. And let's start off by doing that in the beginning.
Yeah. Well, my name is Shawn Baker. I'm a medical doctor. I was trained as an orthopedic surgeon. I practiced for a couple decades doing that. I got interested in nutrition in my, I guess, 40s as I saw, my health starting to sort of go in a way I wasn't happy with, despite the fact that I was kind of a world-class competitive athlete, still training very hard and seeing some problems with my health. So I started playing with different dietary strategies. Eventually, after about 6 or 7 years, I ended up attempting, basically an all meat-based diet, and I got just dramatically uh, good results, and started to just kind of share this with other people, and started to get a little bit of traction on social media at the time. And then eventually ended up being asked to write a book about this. So I wrote a book called The Carnivore Diet, which is something I've been
Awesome.
a pretty big proponent of for the last 5 or 6 years since I've been doing this. And at that time, I've seen tens of thousands of people transform their lives for the better, getting rid of diseases, getting off medications, losing weight, becoming better athletes, on and on and on. So it's been very fascinating. I'm currently the founder of a company called Rivero, and our mission is to transform people's health, to get them off medications and to get them quote unquote cured of diseases. And so we're in that space right now, and growing pretty rapidly at the moment. And that's been kind of the main focus of my life. I'm still like I said, still a competitive athlete. I'm now pursuing a new passion for me called jujitsu, which has been very fun and very entertaining, and enjoying myself with that.
Yeah, I think that's a very important thing to just always try out new things. You like in terms of like exercise and maybe movement. So that's you've already told who you are and what you do. Just for starters, I want to ask you another like two quick questions, which you can probably answer pretty easily. But the first one will be, what's your favorite kind of meal or favorite type of food? Or like if there's like one food you love the most, and you can actually tell us what that is, and your favorite type of exercise. So that might be a specific exercise, it might be some kind of movement, it might be a type of sports, it might be anything, but just tell us what that is.
Well, I mean, when you're asking about I guess the benefits of exercise, I think that there are several things that we should be focusing on. I think one of the most important ones, in my view, is basically strength. I think that is incredibly important to be strong. It doesn't mean you have to be a giant bodybuilder type strong, but you need to be relatively strong for your weight. That's going to provide protection from disease. It's going to provide better functional outcomes. It's going to protect you from injury. If you are participating in the sport, we know that's the number one protective thing you can do as an athlete is to get stronger. I think, obviously having some decent level of cardiovascular fitness is also important. So however you do that, whether it's through, endurance training, or I tend to prefer the higher intensity interval type stuff. I think that's functional. I mean, it's a lot easier to implement as far as from a time standpoint goes. And then, I think the other thing that I think is important is to maintain mobility, flexibility, and explosiveness. A lot of jumping, running, throwing, those types of things that I try to include. So, I mean, I don't know if that answers the question, but I think that's the approach I take to just general health when it comes to exercise, to combine all those components. But I think, you can't just go out and jog and expect to be
Right.
optimally healthy. I think that's something that is, maybe better than nothing, but you're leaving a lot on the table when you do that.
Well, yeah, absolutely, and probably, yeah, like absolutely agree. And maybe we'll be able to talk a bit more about the exact like benefits and of exercise, especially of strength training, because I feel like over the past like decades, there's been that big promotion of jogging and endurance type of training, which definitely maybe has its place, and people tend to maybe disregard the importance of strength training and the effect it has on metabolic health and all that basically. And all right, so a question that I'm curious about, and that
Yeah.
maybe
So
yeah,
I mean,
go ahead.
in general,
Is connection still working?
there's just a long delay. There's a long delay between when you speak
Yeah,
and when I go.
right.
So I think we have a long delay here. So it's
Yeah.
going to make it a little challenging.
Okay. Okay. Let me ask another question. So, you were I remember, like, as far as I can recall, you were involved in some issues regarding your medical license. I think that'd be interesting for people to hear. Maybe you could just elaborate on that a little bit, what has happened there, because maybe people are not familiar with that story.
So I'm not sure you mean what you're referring to, some issues. Do you have something more specific?
Was it the case that you basically had some and what was it, like some issues regarding your medical license being taken away from you for some reasons which I cannot quite recall? Was it that, or am I wrong with something?
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So back in 2017, I went through a peer review process as I was trying to focus more on lifestyle and less on surgery. And the hospital did not really like it that I didn't want to operate as much, because by me doing operations, they made a lot more money. And so when I asked to spend
That's
one
funny.
day a week focusing on lifestyle and preventing illness, that was met with a lot of hostility. And so anyway, we went through a long battle. They invoked a peer review process. They started pulling my records and said that that I had not done this or that correctly. Ultimately, because of that, I voluntarily surrendered my license while I allowed for an independent investigation. The independent investigation showed that I had done nothing wrong, basically, and
Exactly.
my license was then restored. And so it was just kind of I think kind of a sham process that was unfortunate. Fortunately, for me, it ultimately resulted in me sort of becoming more able to help more people. Because now that I
Exactly.
have sort of a company and a platform, and we're literally hundreds of thousands of people's lives. So ultimately, it worked out for the best for me, and hopefully people that I've been able to impact. And so it was kind of an unfortunate time. It was it jaded me quite a bit towards the practice of medicine, when I came to realize it's almost purely about profit, and patient health and outcomes are kind of a secondary concern,
Yeah, like I
at
absolutely
least in the
agree, and
United
I
States.
And I think that's just an important point to mention at this point, because I feel like some people still know you or still remember that, especially people who maybe are not quite supportive of what you do and of what you promote. And so they maybe think like you did something terribly wrong and your medical license was taken away and that you're now not allowed to practice or whatever. And so I think it's important to still understand that that you got it back and that you're still trying to help people, and that's a huge step forward, and that it helped you actually to gain traction and help to reach more people, and that's actually a good thing. And so I'm happy that it's all in the past. That's a matter of the past right now, and it's still, I think, can be considered that it's somewhat of a good thing to have happened, because it has resulted in, as you said, more people reaching out to you, or you being able to reach more people and ultimately being able to help. So let's you've already touched on your health journey and what you have gone through, that you found the way of eating. But what has led you to the path of actually going right against mainstream advice? Because we all hear like all this stuff about not eating meat, red meat is bad, vegetables are good, but you're doing like the exact opposite. What have you led to actually make that decision for your life, and actually recommending that to people and seeing people to improve, would, funnily enough, but what was the first step?
Yeah, well, my decision to eat the way I eat was based purely objectively on the effects it had on my health. The observable, both subjective and objective effects it had on my health. I mean, I'm healthier than I was 10 years ago. Clearly, I'm performing, equally as good or better as an athlete 10 years later in my mid 50s. And so, and the fact that I basically see people every single day of my life that are able to come off medications and reverse diseases by eating a meat-based diet. I mean, I think the results are what they are, and they're undeniable in my mind. Now,
Exactly.
whether that matches a particular belief system, an ideology, or a nutritional dogma is irrelevant. I'm not dogmatic about it. At the end of the day, I'm saying do what works for you personally. I find that
Right.
the food that humans have been eating ever since we've been human is a likely candidate for a food that we're supposed to eat. I mean, it just makes sense. I mean, if we look at what is causing disease from a nutritional standpoint, and I believe nutrition plays a huge role in the causality of diseases, it's the modern food that we've started to include in the diet. It's the highly ultra processed junk food that's everywhere. It's the stuff that you see that occupies 90% of the supermarket. I think fresh, natural foods that we've been eating for at least thousands of years, and in some cases arguably millions of years, is not likely to be something that's killing us. And so we know unequivocally that red meat has been part of the human diet as long as human beings have been on this earth. And for those that believe in
Right.
an evolutionary model, it goes back to roughly 3 million years. And that's Homo habilis and some of the Australopithecine. So we are a meat-eating species, clearly. I think there's pretty good evidence that we were a heavy meat-eating species, particularly if you look at some of the
Exactly.
radioisotopic data coming out of Europe, and you look at just all of the anthropologic historical records that we have. We clearly have always done that, and it's I mean, I can use some of the U.S. data because I'm more familiar with it. I'm not sure on what's going on in Germany, but in the United States, we peaked at our red meat consumption, the beef consumption anyway, in 1977. Since that time, our beef consumption has dropped by around 35 to 40%. And during that time that we've eaten so much less meat, we've developed all kinds of chronic diseases, that have come, we've got more heart disease, more cancer, more
That's true.
diabetes, more obesity, more autoimmune diseases. The other thing is the argument about the climate. Well, we've got less cows now than we did 50 years ago in the entire world. We have less cows today than we did 50 years ago. In the United States, we had 135 million cows in 1970. We now have 95 million cows. So we've decreased the number of cattle on the planet. And yet people are saying they are contributing to increasing greenhouse gases, which again defies any amount of logic that you can look at. And so it is not a environmental issue to the degree that people are making it out. I mean, all things impact the environment, but at the end of the day, all human beings have to eat something. And so there's going to be some amount of impact on the environment. It is not the major driver of climate change. not even close, not even by a long shot, despite the vegan propaganda, which is completely based on, kind of nonsense and non-physical science that is easily refuted. And red meat is not killing people. I mean, it doesn't make sense to make that out.
Obviously.
I mean, there's obviously nutrition science is very, very much strongly biased towards plant-based diets and vegetarianism. In the United States, the American Dietetic Association, founded in 1917, was founded by religious vegetarians from the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and this is the foundation of nutrition science, has been always to push plants. Red meat has there's a religious belief that red meat is somehow sinful because it makes people, it induces carnal thoughts. They become lusty and they do those types of things that are considered bad from a religious standpoint. I would argue that's healthy. If you have a good, healthy sex drive, that's a sign of health, not a sign of debauchery.
That's probably exactly right.
We've got some really bad information out there for most people. The good thing about nutrition, and I think this is something that I find is nice, as opposed to, say, trying to answer climate questions, is I can literally look in the mirror. I don't need any scientific study. I can look in the mirror and tell that I'm healthier. It's very easy. When I'm leaner, when I'm happier, when I feel better, when my joints don't ache, when my digestion is working well, that's clearly a sign of better health. I don't care what anybody says about what lab number you have. These objective things are very easy to assess on oneself. And so that's something that I think we tend to undervalue, in lieu of some kind of random biomarker, which is basically attached to it with a pharmaceutical prescription at the end of it. If your blood pressure is high, here's a drug. If your blood glucose is high, here's a drug. If your cholesterol is high, here's a drug. And therefore, we're going to use these to define health. And, and many people within their normal genetic variation will fall outside what's considered the acceptable ranges, and therefore will then offer, a treatment that's going to benefit some corporation.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, there's lots of crazy stuff going on, and you've touched on many very important points that we might actually dive a bit deeper in later in the podcast. And you touched on how the situation is here in Germany. It's, as far as I can tell, especially like in my age group, veganism seems to really flourish. It's like the use it's maybe pretty similar in the USA, and there's still that movement going on, but all the people, I feel like there's this, I don't want to say anti-vegan movement, but people in our space who are like pro meat and meat based. It's start to get really big out there, but in Germany that's not really going on. It's not really happening. So it's still something that needs to spread a bit more, because I feel like Germany is a bit lacking behind. Like the USA does something and Germany catches up a bit later on. So maybe that will come eventually. Yeah, let's see how things will develop. So yeah. And now
yeah, I mean, it's
sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, Germany is a country known for, sausage and, some of these other things that have been part of the German culture forever. And so when you start seeing increases in obesity, increases in mental health disorders, a generation of people, of men that have become soft and weak, you're going to see that's related to the nutritional strategy. And so I think as if you end up switching to a plant-based diet, which I hope you don't, you'll see negative consequences for the population. We know, for instance, vegan diets, when it comes to children, are associated pretty strongly with cognitive delays, developmental delays, underweight or underdeveloped children. And it is, I think it's something that is actually harmful to kids and should be strongly pushed against.
Yeah, absolutely. I would totally agree with that. And before maybe talking about the value that animal products actually provide to our bodies and to children's bodies, let's maybe carefully try, or maybe not that carefully, just try to tackle the notion of vegan diets and plant-based diets being the be all end all and being the best diets ever, because I feel like this is still stuck in people's head that vegetables are a necessary part of our diets, and there's nothing healthier than a green salad and kale and whatnot. And just from your perspective, as someone who has experienced it on yourself and worked with many people, and who knows the literature on that, what are maybe your biggest concerns with long-term veganism, or just veganism in general, plant-based dieting? Yeah, basically, what's your take on that?
Well, I mean, we know that plant-based diets are associated with declines in mental health. That's whether that is causative or there's reverse causality. That is to say, whether the plant-based diet is causing decreases in mental health, higher rates of depression, suicide, anxiety, or people with mental health disorders adopt vegan diets for whatever reason. We don't know which way the arrow points, but there's certainly a number of plausible mechanisms by which those mental health disorders would occur. Some of it has to do with nutrient deficiencies, B12, zinc, iron, carnitine, creatine, things like that, which we can only get largely. I mean, some of them, not all, but many of those are much more prevalent in animal-based diets. And so, Stanford University 2018 study looking at major depressive disorders found that carnitine deficiency, relative carnitine deficiency, was a big component of that. And we know that plant-based diets often leave people with a relative carnitine deficiency. Carnitine is something we can make ourselves, but there's a limit to how much we can make, and the rest we need to get from our diet. If you're on a plant-based diet, you're not getting that. Bone fractures. We know there was a recent study came out looking at vegan diets and fractures of bones, and they saw something like a 40% increase in fracture risk, hip fractures, wrist fractures, spine fractures in people on plant-based diets. I talked about some of the issues with children. A number of studies show no benefit whatsoever to a plant-based diet when it comes to longevity. One of the larger ones was a study on 250,000 people in Australia looking at outcomes, mortality outcomes, and they found no difference for somebody who adopts a plant-based diet. A recent study out of Italy, done in Tuscan, Italy, called the ENG study, just showed that for every 1% increase in energy from animal protein, showed a 4% decrease in mortality. So the more meat or animal protein you ate, the less likely you were to die. And this is a study came out this earlier this year. So there's a number of scientific literature you can point to for the problems of plant-based diet. Now, that's not to say there aren't studies that go the other way. There are. I think nutrition is very much a very confusing field. I think a lot of the tools that we use to do nutritional research are poor. Most of them are epidemiologic studies, which don't really help us much. They're kind of, in my mind, a waste of time. All the randomized control trials that have ever been done have never shown meat to be a problem for health. We know that, again, I'm a proponent of higher protein diets, and I think animal protein is by far the best source of protein that we can get. And we know that as you have more lean muscle mass, I'm not talking about giant, huge, bodybuilding, but the stronger you are relative to your weight, the more lean mass you have relative to fat mass, the better your quality of life is going to be, and the longer you're going to live, quite honestly, and less likely you are going to have disease. And so a plant-based diet is not optimal for that. In many cases, it is downright counterproductive. You see a lot of these plant-based advocates, and many of them lose weight, but they also lose a tremendous amount of muscle. They often, become quote unquote skinny fat, which is maybe not much better than being obese. Having said that, I think the biggest intervention you can do with regard to lean muscle mass is strength training. We talked about that at the beginning about exercise, right. But strength training, regardless of your diet, is going to have the biggest lever that you can pull. But if you want to put all the factors in your favor, strength training with adequate high quality protein, and again, that's animal source protein, is probably the best way to achieve that.
Yeah, absolutely. These are very good points to point towards. And I personally also know I know quite a few of people who are vegans, and I must honestly admit that they do not necessarily look particularly healthy. And if you talk to them, you oftentimes realize that they oftentimes feel weak and forget things. It's pretty interesting. And I personally know a good friend of mine who was vegan for a year, and he's now like eating big quantities of meat. And he, after just 1 year, and he's young, you might say that young people can tolerate vegan diets better because they still have maybe better conversion rates of certain nutrients, or until certain deficiencies actually manifest, that might take some time. But just after a year, he was having an insane list of all kinds of symptoms that he could point towards after just 1 year of veganism. And so he said that it absolutely, wrecked his health after just 1 year. And there's so many of these stories, and it seems like animal products have some, unique value in providing all these essential nutrients. And also, you touched on protein. Maybe you could just elaborate a bit more on that from your point of view, because um, there's this notion that there's nothing essential in meat products, whereas that it clearly is, and people somehow don't believe them to be nutritious. Like if you ask a random person on the street, what's the most nutrient dense food on the planet, everyone will say, I don't know, like kale or some salad or a vegetable or a fruit. Nobody will say meat or anything that comes from an animal. So just maybe talking about the benefits and the value of animal products and why it's so crucial to include them. What would you say on that to someone?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think first of all, when we look at, what comprises a human diet, we look at it from the context of macronutrients. And so we know essential macronutrients include essential amino acids. Meat has all of them. Most plant-based products do not have all of them. So you end up having to cobble together different diets, and meat has it in the ratio that we need, the exact ratios that human beings need those things. We have the right amount of lysine and leucine and valine and isoleucine and on and on and on. Whereas plant-based diets have them in ratios that aren't necessarily appropriate for us. The other thing is fats. Fats are essential. We have essential fatty acids. Carbohydrates are non-essential. We don't need carbohydrates. They can be beneficial for sure, but we don't need them. And so just from a macronutrient standpoint, and then we go to the micronutrients where we talk about vitamins and minerals. And that, there's a list of, 30, 40 of those that most people would point to. Meat has basically all of that with a few sort of minor exceptions, things like vitamin C being one, which we ultimately can get through animal-based sources if we choose to do it that route. But I think just as importantly, there are a lot of nutrients in meat. In fact, meat has something like 50,000 separate compounds. It's not like, protein, fat, and a few vitamins. There's 50,000
That's so
unique
true.
compounds within meat. Stefan van Vliet's study at Duke University demonstrated that. And they compared the Impossible Burger, which is, basically a mixture of soybeans and coconut oil and
Right.
a bunch of other just ingredients, and found that only 10% of the compounds found in meat, and they looked at something like 2,000 compounds, only 10% of those were actually found in the plant-based version. And so meat is more, people like to talk about phytonutrients. Well, we know that cattle, for instance, have a much more diverse diet when it comes to phytonutrients than human beings do, because they can eat all these different plants. They can eat grass and
Right.
shrubs and flowers and leaves and all the things that are toxic to humans. So they have a very wide variety of these phytonutrients, and those phytonutrients actually end up in the actual meat itself. And so even though you're not consuming the plants, you're getting those phytonutrients regardless. And some of that has to do with how, what the animal is raised on. But meat is something that is also more bioavailable. There's a term called an anti-nutrient, which basically is something found in food that prevents absorption of vitamins and minerals. And, many of those things are found in plants. And we know that things like oxalates will bind up minerals like calcium and magnesium and other things. We know that, things like phytic acid will, bind up zinc. And so you can't, if you're eating a lot of phytic acid, where do you get phytic acid from? You get it from a lot of plant sources. You get it like, beans and legumes, particularly certain grains will have a lot of phytic acid in it, and that'll prevent the absorption of other these critical nutrients. And so, iron, again, heme iron versus non-heme iron. Heme iron is much more highly absorbable than is, non-heme iron, which you find in, leafy green vegetables, which everybody likes to talk about. The other thing is fiber itself is something that prevents the absorption of nutrition. And so when you hear about eat all these vegetables, if you go back into the history of, even Europe, I'm sure Germany, 300 or 400 years ago, vegetables were considered not particularly desirable. It was something that the peasants ate. If you serve vegetables to your guest, if you were wealthy, it would be considered almost an insult because you didn't have anything better to feed them.
Right.
And so we have this belief that vegetables are great for us, basically based on the fact that if you're eating a lot of vegetables and you fill up on that, you're not going to eat the junk food. And there is some benefit in doing that, but it's not because
Right.
they're so inherently super nutritious and great for us. It's just that they're better than something else that's really bad for us. I think the best food we can eat and the food that's going to be the most nutritious, provide us the most benefit, is going to be the food that human beings have sought out and been willing to kill other animals to get. It's hard work getting meat, and it's been risky. And why do we do that when we could just sit there and pick grapes, right? Why does every single tribe in the planet, no matter where they live, spend hours a day hunting, even if they live in the tropics? You see these Bolivian, Brazilian, South American tribes that live, and there's fruit everywhere. And if they could live on a fruit-based diet, they would, but they can't because they're out there killing whatever they can, monkeys and jaguars and whatever they can get, little pigs. So yeah, meat is so essential to the human diet, and it's more than just protein and fat. It is choline, all these nutrients are critical for brain function, brain development. And I think we see that, a lot of people that you mentioned, they go on a vegan diet for a year and they can't think straight. That doesn't happen to everybody, but certainly many of them. And that's why, something like 80+% of people that go on a vegan diet quit within a year because they realize it just doesn't work for me.
Yeah, exactly. You've mentioned some excellent point there. Like, I've been just talking to Rafa Sotoli the other day, and he's another scientist who's extremely interested in evolutionary biology, and just citing some of his work. And we've been thoroughly discussing his paper that he wrote together with Mickey Bendor on basically all lines of evidence that are strongly pointing in the direction of us having evolved to actually be heavy meat eaters and hypercarnivores. So there's lots of evidence, and we've been doing that throughout history. And as you said, like another man who is very famous for having discovered that is actually Weston Price, who's been like thrown around in our community all the time, because he is the one who was traveling the world and actually discovered that every single tribe was focusing basically on animal products, even if there was an abundance of plant foods in their place. As you said, like they have lots of fruits and they've lots of plant foods around, but they still go out hunting. And so this is why it's so crucial. And what I find especially fascinating, what you mentioned about the different compounds in meat, I think that's a very important point for people to realize. We love to focus on these macronutrients and micronutrients, but there is, like, as you said, 50 thousand compounds in meat, and we don't necessarily know everything. Maybe there's like this dark matter. Maybe there is this these certain types of nutrients which we are not aware actually might have a function in our body and may actually contribute to our health. And so that's what people love to forget, and love just saying micronutrients and macronutrients, and you could get everything from plants, but maybe that's not going to be optimal for your long-term health.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just comment. I know both Rafi and Mickey Bendor. I've had dinner with both of those guys. I've talked to them extensively. I mean, again, there's multiple lines of evidence that can inform us as to what we should eat. You could look at modern nutritional studies, but also some of the anthropologic record. If I want to see if I have a pet zebra, I'm going to know I'm not going to go to the grocery store and ask the zebra what he wants to eat. I'm going to make that diet based on what I can observe what a wild zebra would eat, and that's how I would pattern that diet. And so if we look at what are wild humans, and I argue that there's not a lot of wild humans left, and many of the ones that you would consider indigenous right now have really been kind of pushed to the edges of society, and they're not in their natural element anymore. And we know from the work of many paleozoologists that the climate, both, temperature, climate, weather, and the food availability climate was very, very different back, 50,000, 100,000, particularly 100,000 years ago and earlier,
True.
where we had a tremendous amount of megafaunal animals to choose from. And we did that, and we exploited those guys, those things to the degree that we could, to the point that they became largely extinct. And so that was the preferred human diet, was big animals that had a decent amount of fat on them, that were, relatively easy to kill because they didn't run away, and they weren't scared of humans. And we just, because we had superior technology, as we evolved that over a period of a couple million years, we were in a very good position. And as you probably are aware, human beings were stronger, bigger, had larger brains
Exactly.
than we do now. And as we into, we became, we developed civilization, and we developed agriculture, we actually got weaker and sicker as a species, as individuals. The population was allowed to expand because of stable food supplies, but we became less of a lesser species because of that.
Yeah, that's pretty unfortunate in some sense, but it's still, in that way it actually shows us what we should be looking for if we want to achieve optimal health. And so that's hopefully something that people might take as an important takeaway from today's podcast, essentially. Because if I could, that's what I always say, if I could formulate two most important rules for nutrition, like the first one would be obviously to cut out junk food as much as possible, and the second one would be to include more high quality nutritious animal foods in your diet as much as possible, because they would provide all these unique nutrients and with all these benefits, animal protein, everything that's has to do with this. So I hope this is something that people will understand. And another point that I've been thinking about more and more recently is actually the ethical argument of veganism, because that's where it actually is somehow, coming from. That's in my experience talking to people, that's the main reason for why they how they justify their basically their switch to veganism. And then they add to that initial argument, they add to that it's super healthy and it's good for the climate, but it comes from that ideological aspect of not killing animals and being actually morally superior in some sense. So, and I've been thinking about that, and I'm curious about what your take on that is, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have any moral qualms about eating meat. It doesn't bother me. I don't feel like I'm doing anything bad. This is what humans have done since the beginning of time. This is what our species does. I have no more remorse for eating an animal than a lion does. I mean,
Right.
fortunately, the way humans kill animals for our food is the most humane way possible. If we want to look at, just pure sentience, how many animals have to die for my food? I eat, probably the equivalent of 2 cows of food a year, I mean, in my diet. So 2 animals have to die directly for me to sustain myself for a year. If you are on a plant-based diet, there is going to be the death of literally thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of animals.
Exactly.
Just to grow crops anywhere in the world, you have to exterminate every single creature that lives on that land. You spray pesticides. Pesticides are not unintentional. They are designed to kill things.
Right.
Ranchers and farmers that find animals eat mass extinctions, and these animals that die, they're not turned into food for humans. They're left in a field to rot. Now, maybe some predator or scavenger will eat them, or maybe they'll just rot. Their death is not a pleasant death. They're either ripped apart because they've been displaced and right in the mouth of a predator, or they're dying of a poison, and that's not a pleasant death. Whereas we dispatch animals in basically under a second. They're rendered unconscious, don't feel anything, and they're dead, despite what they believe what's going on in slaughterhouse videos. The slaughterhouse is a very much regulated position, a place where they minimize to eliminate any animal suffering at all. The other thing is, they're saying, well, these animals don't live a full life. The reality is, let's take cattle, for instance, or dairy cattle is probably the best example. A dairy cow may live 6, 8, 10, 12, 14 years. In the wild, that animal will be lucky to live more than 6 months. That's the reality. What does a
Right.
prey animal do? They die at the hands of predators. There's a study out of the University of Pennsylvania looking at the white-tailed deer population, and they tagged a bunch of little baby deer, and they followed them, and they found out that close to 50% of them died before 30 weeks of age, and they were ripped apart by predators, or they starved to death, or they got some disease. That is not a pleasant way to die. And so anybody that thinks that we are cruel because we raise animals, and the other thing is, and I can speak particularly to cattle. Cattle have a very comfortable life relative to any other wild animal in the world. I mean, you may not like to live in a barn and sleep on sand, but for a cow that has shelter, which has food delivered to it anytime it wants, that has temperature control, it can get its back scratched when it wants, gets clean drinking water anytime it wants. That is a very, very good life for an animal. And so they're actually treated extremely well. There's no rancher or farmer in the world that's serious about it, particularly in Western developed countries, that wants to see their animals suffer in any way, because it's bad for their business. It's bad for their ability to produce. And so they want to treat them with as much compassion, care as possible. And yes, at the end of the day, they're using them for food, but it's a very symbiotic relationship. And the cows that if they have a nice warm shelter, they're gonna choose coming in the shelter than standing out in the cold and freezing weather. Anybody would do that. When I stick him outside in the snow, he wants to run back inside because it's cold. The ethical argument is nonsensical. The people that say, well, we grow crops to feed animals. That's true. 36% of the crops in the world, the grain crops, I should say, are fed to animals. The other 64% goes to human production. And by the way, most of the grain products are byproducts, like things like soybean meal. It's already been pressed for human consumption. The other thing is all these other crops outside of just grains, outside of cereal grains, there's potatoes and there's strawberries and tomatoes and melons and olives. None of those things are fed to livestock for the most part. It's all fed to humans. So animals, while they are fed crops, it's a relatively small percentage. This is data from the FAO. You can look that up. It's not, vegans will say it's the majority of crops are fed to animals. That's total bullshit. It's not true at all. But regardless, they actually upcycle protein. And so if we look at high quality protein, which is the most expensive and difficult macronutrient to get, high quality protein, if an animal eats 10 pounds, or if the animal eats 6 pounds of grain, it will make 10 pounds of protein. 10 pounds of grain protein, or 6 pounds of grain protein, it'll make 10 pounds of beef protein, which is an upside. And nothing else can do it. Meat can't do it. Synthetic lab meat can't do it. Vegetables sure as heck can't do it. And so you get a high quality protein product for less. So you can't just feed that. If anybody goes and sees what cows actually eat, and you would say, well, why don't you eat that? It's inedible to humans. No one would want to eat that. So they're not stealing anyone's food. They're eating, if we look at a stalk of corn, a big corn plant, which is, 2.5, 3 meters high, and it's got a few more ears of corn, the human might be able to eat some of the ears of corn. They wouldn't eat the cob, but the cow eats the entire plant. They eat everything. They eat all of that. That's stuff that you can't use. You and I can't eat. And so again, it's just complete nonsense that they're stealing all the humans' food.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you've mentioned so many crucial things there, and aside, like coming back to the ethical argument, I think that's what people just fail to recognize. I think mostly maybe that has to do with the fact that we are so disconnected with the actual reality of how things work out there on the fields and farms, because people are growing up, all these vegans, they're mostly growing up in the civilized world. They just see the plant, they see, oh, it's a plant, it's not an animal, so I'm not killing anyone. But you probably know the quote, like it's how is it, it's like it's still death, but there's no blood on the plate, something along those lines. So it's still there's some very interesting evidence. Like I know a paper which actually showed that there's many times more animals actually killed by growing crops. And so it's a very, stupid thing to refer towards as saying that you kill lots of animals if you continue to eat meat. And so I'm absolutely in agreement with you, and I really hope that people will give it another thought and realize that they actually will do less harm if they include more meat in their diets, which is interesting.
Yeah, I mean, there's a study that I think you referred to, it's out of Australia, where they looked at comparing growing a kilo of wheat versus
Right.
a kilo of beef. And what they found is that to grow a kilo of wheat, there were 25 more times animals killed than to grow a kilo of beef. And so you're killing, to eat your sandwich with the bread, you're killing 25 times more animal than if you ate the beef patty. And so for sure, that's the there's a big difference in there. And what we do have is a huge media propaganda campaign to push for plant-based meat. And the reason for that now is just corporate greed. They want a big chunk of the meat industry's profit margin, and they want to develop a $200-300 billion industry. And that's why you get all this marketing, and people fall for it. They're very good at selling it, but it's based on complete mistruths. Misinformation is a big word.
Yeah, right. And well, but as you already alluded to, like if you actually look at the ingredients from a plant-based piece of, animal product, plant-based, no, it's not animal product, plant-based meat or plant-based burger, whatever. And then you actually can see that how this actually does harm your health if you look at the ingredients. So I think that no clear, straightforward thinking human being would actually consider a plant-based burger to be anything that might in some sense be healthier than a piece of actual meat or a piece of egg. It's kind of ridiculous how people fall for it. But I've seen the stock margins decline actually, so people are less and less attracted to plant-based burgers. I think that's a good thing that we should celebrate.
Yeah, we're seeing, like particularly a company called Beyond Meat, which is one of the leading fake meat companies that's had a huge amount of investment pumped into it. It had a public offering on the stock exchange. It launched with a lot of fanfare and celebrity and paid propaganda. And now we're seeing that, one, it's never turned a profit as a company, and two, its year-over-year sales from last year to this year have dropped something like 10%. So the interest is continuing to wane despite all of the messaging and the nonsense about how great it is. And people are waiting. People realize it's just processed garbage, and nobody really wants that stuff. And so I think that we're gonna continue to see, depending on who makes policy, where they're going to try to continue to push. The EU has announced, meat is a cancer, and we're going to, carcinogenic, which is again basically nonsense, and we're going to push for plant-based diets and force you to eat this stuff, which is basically a corporate agenda. It's not a person's agenda. It's not to help anybody. It's just to help these corporations make more profit. And we should realize that at its face. I mean, it makes no sense that we would be eating this synthetic food and thinking it's going to be better for us than
absolutely
what humans are designed to eat. There's no other animal on the planet that gets sick from eating meat. There are no other planet, any animal that naturally eats meat, a lion, a cat, a dog, a pig, anything, they don't get sick from eating meat. They don't, and neither do humans. But it's just this complete nonsense.
Right. And if anyone is interested in the physiological evidence of why we're actually designed in some sense, where our body is actually made and evolved to eat meat, then I'll just refer back to the podcast I just did with Raphael Sertoli, and we discussed that on that podcast, why actually we're evolved to eat big amounts of meat, and how our physiology actually shows that that's the case. But coming back to the whole propaganda issue, one thing that I realized coming up more recently, and blowing up more and more, it's like they still mention the health part of the conversation, and we might go into that later on. But what they're really focusing on now is like climate. It's like killing the climate, and you've already touched on that there's like data showing that the number of cows, which is kind of the most compelling argument, the number of cows has actually somewhat declined. It didn't increase like in the most part. So that's the most important message, and that's why this doesn't make sense. But how does it's insane how much focus gets directed towards meat being the culprit and the most important cause for climate change. I just can't understand where that's coming from. Like, even if that was a cause, it's obviously not the main cause, but why does all the media attention gets directed towards meat, 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 and nothing else? Like, we shouldn't do anything else about climate change. It's the meat, and you should eat less meat. And it's like it's crazy. Like, I don't really understand where that's coming from.
Well, I think it comes from the fact that they are trying to get individuals to sacrifice whatever their health, in my view, so that corporations, big corporations who pay the politicians, don't have to. You know, the big oil and gas companies, where if we're going to point to a anthropogenic source of climate change, you would have to point to the fossil fuel industry, which, you know, for instance, in the United States, um, fossil fuels in the form of the transportation, energy, and the industrial sector account for about 80% of our greenhouse gas emissions. In the United States, animal agriculture accounts for 4% of greenhouse gas emissions versus 80%. Cows are only 2%. So of the United States, 2% of our greenhouse gases comes from cows, 80% comes from fossil fuels, 5% comes from plant agriculture. It is a tremendously, relatively small amount when you talk about beef. You know, so they're saying that, you know, instead of you giving up beef, the alternative would be the transportation sector to make more fuel efficient cars, which costs a lot of money, and they don't want to pay that because, you know, they like making their profit, and they'll pay off the politicians to do this. You know, there's just huge corporate interests. These companies that are trying to push this, you know, less meat agenda are petrochemical companies, pharmaceutical companies, you know, agricultural fossil fuel companies that want to see more of their profits going up. And so by eating meat, you cut into their profits. And
Right.
certainly if we can tell everybody to look away from the transportation sector or the energy sector, the oil and gas sector, then they're going to do that. And they're incredibly powerful and incredibly well financed. And so I personally don't, you know, I think there's evidence that maybe all of it's all overblown to some degree, but meat is clearly not the main driver. One of the things they talk about, like I said, in the United States, where I live, and probably very similar in Germany, agriculture is a tiny fraction of our greenhouse gas emissions. Now, there's a worldwide report done by the IPCC that looks at, you know, it was actually a livestock's long shadow, which was done by the FAO in 2006. That is that's a 15-year-old study, and since that time we've discovered so much more about it. But people still go back and quote that and saying that, you know, animal agriculture is responsible for 14% of greenhouse gas emissions. That's on par with transportation, and therefore we should stop eating meat. Well, the problem with that study is it's a worldwide study, and so when we compare animal agriculture emissions versus transportation sector in most of Africa, say Sudan, I mean, there's not a lot of transportation there. There's not a lot of roads even there, and so you've got a much higher contribution. If we were to roll back the clock 100 years before, you know, or 150 years before the modern industrial revolution, everything would be coming from animal agriculture because there's nothing else there. But today, you know, we have this huge amount. So I live in the United States, you live in Germany, most of your listeners live, you know, in a Western developed country.
Yes.
The big threat is not animal agriculture. It's clearly not. And, you know, the argument about, you know, deforestation in Brazil, also, it is a completely, you know, in the United States, we import less than 1% of our beef from Brazil. I don't know what Germany probably has a higher amount, I'm imagining, but in the United States, it's a tiny amount. The deforestation in Brazil is the rate of deforestation has gone down every year. They've been doing less and less than that. They've been better at that. In the United States and in Europe, there's more forest than there ever has been. In the last 100 years, cover has recovered, and there's more and more forest than there's ever been. And so some of these arguments are basically, they're taken out of context. They're referring to other parts of the world that don't affect you and I. By me cutting down on meat, it will have zero impact on the Brazilian forest. Zero. The same thing with you, most likely. By me cutting back on meat, it'll have almost zero impact on worldwide greenhouse gas emissions. In fact, based on the numbers that are there, and Professor Frank Mitloner out of UC Davis has done this quite well. If every single American, there's 330 or 340 million of us now, if all of us quit meat and gave up and became vegans, and also we had to kill every single cow, every single sheep, every single pig, every single chicken, every cat, every dog, every horse, every dairy cow, on the entire country, we would only decrease worldwide greenhouse gas emissions by 0.3%.
Right.
I mean, that's just crazy. So a meatless Monday day does absolutely nothing. It's pure virtue signaling. It has no benefit whatsoever. All it does is make you look stupid and decrease your nutrition.
Yeah, in some sense that makes absolute sense. And I must say the situation here in Germany is somewhat similar probably to what is going on in the US. Although I must say, like, most of the meat we're buying here is there's lots of meat actually coming from Germany. I haven't really seen that much coming from other countries, in spite of, like, there's some US beef sold, but still most of the meat comes from Germany. So I think we're pretty good at that. And what you mentioned at the end, like, it's somewhat crazy. And if we just, I think we need to just follow the money in some sense, because if we follow the money and look where it goes, we can quickly realize why meat gets the blame, because there's not much money made with that. But as you say, if we focus on the other things, then we actually harm the big corporations who made the biggest chunk, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's the key. I mean, we've got again, a corporation's job is to make money for its shareholders. They don't really care how it happens, just that it happens. And if someone benefits from it, great. If not, no big deal. And so I think most of the companies that produce food, they don't produce it for your health. They produce it for their profit. And we can sort of bypass that system by working locally with the suppliers around us, get to know a farmer, get to know a rancher.
Exactly.
I'm sure I know they have them in Germany. They have them in the United States. I've got half a cow coming to my house here in a few weeks, and so
that's awesome.
That's something we do.
Yeah, I think if people get just in touch with all these things that you just mentioned, support their farmers, support actually the local farmers around them. I think we can make this whole thing so much better, because we know that actually farming and regenerative agriculture will absolutely help the environment. And this just makes common sense, because the cows and the plants live together in a way that it is supposed to be, and that it as it has been over the course of the past, like, thousands and millions of years. And so if we just take it away and think that that's the way how we can fix the environment, I think that's just stupid to assume for someone. So, right. If we now make a segue into the health aspect that many people love referring to, it's like, it gives us heart disease, it gives us cancer, and it's horrible. You shouldn't eat meat because meat is carcinogenic. It's like type 2 carcinogenic, the same class, or type 1 for processed red meat, same class as cigarettes. And so vegans say, it's worse than cigarettes for some reason. And there are all these crazy, health documentary movies like The Game Changers and What the Health and whatnot, and which actually try to draw this beautiful picture of plants being awesome and animal foods being absolutely detrimental to your health. So my question is, how does it get such a horrible name, basically? How is it? It's not, because if we look at the hazard ratios, they're not that impressive. If we look at the evidence, it's not impressive, but still everyone is convinced that we should cut back on meat.
Yeah, I mean, and you touch on that. We're looking at relative risk and absolute risk reductions. People don't understand the difference between that. The studies, the study you referenced was a IARC study that was done in Lyon, France, back in 2015. For the World Health Organization, and basically that panel of 20 or so authors concluded that red meat was a class 2 carcinogen, processed meat was class class 1 carcinogen. If you talk to people that were on the panel, and people like Professor David Clearfield, who has spoken about this,
and he's been the podcast
of
like Food Life, for example. Brian Sanders, I've been listening to him. It's insane what he's been saying.
Brian had him on. Right, and so basically he said that panel was an absolute complete joke. It was a travesty. They completely ignored any data whatsoever that would go against their conclusion. Many members of that panel were vegan vegetarians or Seventh-day Adventists that were certainly highly biased. That was not disclosed. The data was almost purely based on epidemiologic studies, which are basically nonsense, particularly when the hazard ratios are, as you pointed out, so low, 1.1, 1.2. It's almost worthless data. When you compare that to the smoking data, where not 1.1, 1.2, but 20 and 30 times the relative risk, absolute risk reduction. And this study was basically focused on colorectal cancer. If we look at the population baseline, 4% of the people will develop colon cancer. By eating meat, it raises your risk by less than 1%, absolute risk, which is pretty minimal, even if you believe that data. And so there's been another study, a very large look at the study come out in 2019 by an organization called Nutrirex, which was led by, he was one of the senior authors, Gordon Guyat, who is someone who basically coined the term evidence-based medicine. He was a father of this back in 1990. He came up with the term, and he has been focusing on high-quality evidence for his entire career. And that panel, basically concluded there was no strong evidence whatsoever to show that meat is causing cancer, meat is causing heart disease. There has never been a single randomized control trial that's ever been done that's shown red meat causes any of these diseases. Now it can shift biomarkers around and things like that, but that is not causing disease. That is something that most people don't understand. And they to think that if you're worried about cancer, then you should worry about obesity. That's probably a much bigger risk. And I can tell you, people that I deal with that eat red meat-based diets, even to the point of totality, where the whole diet is red meat, they're on a carnivore diet, they lose weight, they get leaner, their blood pressure gets better, their insulin resistance gets better. Every other factor that would be associated with increasing your cancer risk goes down. And so again, this is all just based on very, very poor science that gets blown up, it gets propagandized, and it's something that the average person has no able to discern what's truth and what's not, and they don't look at the evidence on its true value.
Exactly, and then we have, like, also, in addition to the pretty weak epidemiological evidence almost in totality, we have actually also epidemiological evidence pointing in the exact opposite direction. So there's not unique, like, true consensus in science when it comes to that topic in that regard. Because as you mentioned in the beginning, there was that recent study which showed that the more animal protein people ate, the longer they lived. Or what was that study? Like, there's some evidence, especially for elderly people, like the more animal protein they consumed, the better that was for their health. So there is, and also cohorts from Asia, right? There's like the exact opposite, because it's not confounded so much by this heavy healthy user bias of meat being associated with something bad, and that's why people who eat more meat do more harmful things, and people who eat less meat do less other harmful things. And so that's not that much the case in Asia, and that's why the studies from Asia actually don't show that effect. And so if we just look at all these things and take into account that there's this healthy user bias and look at all the evidence, we see that this just doesn't hold up, which is pretty fascinating if you look at the whole picture, right? And
yeah, you're correct in that. Yeah, I mean, when we look at, like the Inchianti study, which is done out of Italy this year in 2021 in Tuscany, they looked at, I think 20,000 people, and they followed them for 20 years, and they found that the people that ate the most animal protein lived longer, had less heart disease. That's an epidemiologic study. You're right. Most of the Asian data does not show any relationship whatsoever to red meat consumption or processed meat consumption, for that matter.
Exactly.
with any type of GI cancer. And the reason for that is probably what you pointed out. In Asia, meat is not considered a bad thing. In fact, it's considered a sign of wealth and success, and it's celebrated. Whereas here in the United States, it's associated with poverty and junk food and fast food and people that don't take care of themselves. And you do have this huge healthy user bias. And so why does that, why does it not hold true in Asia? If meat was really bad for us, it would hold true in pretty much all populations, across the board. But we're seeing this tremendous counter, as I think it's anybody with any degree of common sense. I mean, we've been eating meat for millions of years. And even when we developed agriculture, when we didn't have to eat meat anymore, we still chose to eat it because
that's right.
What we're designed to eat. But as we've added in the modern foods, whether it's ultra processed food, most of the stuff we see in the grocery store, which is a combination of a lot of chemicals that probably we're not designed to eat. High fructose corn syrup. Some people point to the different oils, the industrial lubricants were then turned into food. The processed grain, which we can never eat until they figured out how to do some of those things, and that now makes up 60 to 70% of the American diet. That is the problem. It's not the meat we eat. The meat we eat is very small. In the United States, the average American only eats about 2 ounces of beef per day.
That's pretty ridiculous.
That's a tiny amount of the overall calories. And to blame cancer and all these other things on that, and not look at these other things is just ludicrous. It's beyond ridiculous. So yeah, it's anybody with any degree of common sense can see through this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just coming now back to the diet you follow, to the carnivore diet and to the diet you're promoting. The question that arises basically for me and maybe for other people is, would you say that adopting an all, and I know your stance on that. I've been listening to you, to your appearances on other podcasts, and it's pretty interesting because I think you get somewhat misrepresented in that regard, because people just pick certain things that you say and that you promote, and they frame you in some way, and then if you actually listen to what you're saying and you listen to the conversations you're having with people on podcasts, then you realize that your approach is much more nuanced than how people love to misrepresent you in that regard. But still, who would you say, what would be your recommendation for most people? Would you say that everyone should follow a carnivore diet? That's the first question. And the second question is, is there a certain group of people which a carnivore diet would be particularly helpful for? Or what have you seen in your sort of over the time that you've been working with people where it has been very, very helpful in mitigating certain diseases, or, actually making people, in some sense also put certain diseases into remission? And then we can also actually talk about the study that has been done, which has also showed some good success on that thing.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I'm nowhere in any media that I've ever said that everybody needs to be on a carnivore diet.
Right.
I've never said that. I've been very much excited by the number of people that have been benefited by it. And I think there's certain utilities for it. I think, if you're talking about general recommendation, just cut out processed garbage. I mean, people quibble about the definition of processed. Yes, hamburger is technically processed, but we know what we're talking, the ultra processed food that's in boxes and packages that most people eat. It's hyper palatable. Stop that stuff. Just switch to real whole unprocessed food for the most part, including meat, including dairy, including eggs. Fresh fruits and vegetables. If that floats your boat, that's fine too for most people. Now, who uniquely seems to do really well on a carnivore diet? Well, I mean, certainly we know that diabetics tend to do well by cutting carbohydrates out, at least when it comes to getting off medications, improving their A1C, controlling their blood glucose. So that's a group that I think does pretty well with a carnivore-ish, maybe strict, maybe not. People with primary gut diseases like Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, irritable bowel syndrome, and a few other ones tend to do pretty well on carnivore diets, at least for a period of time, and then they may be able to transition to something a little less restrictive. People with autoimmune inflammatory diseases, rheumatoid arthritis, psoriatic arthritis, psoriasis, Hashimoto's thyroiditis, ankylosing spondylitis, these types of diseases, psoriasis, eczema, these types of issues tend to do very well with a carnivore diet, where most other things don't seem to help. Going on a pure elimination diet seems to sort those people out better than really any other approach that I'm aware of. And so these are the folks. In fact, we are about to start doing some clinical trials on those types of diseases.
Awesome.
Here over the next year or two. And so we'll see if, like I said, if my observations and the observations of others actually holds up. I know unequivocally that there are people that, for instance, they have psoriasis and it goes away. I mean, I've seen that over and over and over again, pretty reliably. We'd like to put a clinical trial on there to sort of better, document that, so that more people maybe feel more comfortable with it, particularly those people in the medical community. And so that's what our company will be doing as part of our attempt to grow larger and treat more people and become a fully medical company, which is what we'll be doing this year. So yeah, those are the studies. There's a study out of Harvard University, which was an observational study, so not the highest quality of evidence, but it did just document 2,000 people on a carnivore diet. What happened to them? They were anywhere from 6 months on the diet to up to 28 years, which I thought was pretty impressive that somebody was in there doing it for 28 years.
That's impressive.
And generally, they documented pretty darn good health. And in particular, I think the one highlight of that study, which I thought was really interesting, was they had a couple hundred diabetics in that cohort, and 100% of the diabetics came off all of their injectable medications that were non-insulin, and then 94% of them got off all their insulin, and then 84% of them got off all other medications, including things like metformin, which is one of the last to go. So
Right.
It's probably one of the most powerful interventions I've ever seen for diabetes care. But again, this is the limitation of that study it's observational. There's a selection bias for people that stayed on the diet, and so we have to see what an actual intervention would look like and how much support was required to keep people to stay consistent on the diet and on and on and on. But I suspect it's far better than the standard of care.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's still funny that this like I've shared that study on Instagram, and I've received some pushback, namely people are saying things like, yeah, the results are overblown and this and that, and criticizing certain aspects of it. But in the end, what counts and what the most important thing was, I think, is just that this study showed us that there is, at least that's one thing that we can say for sure, there's definitely no unique harm to eating lots and lots and lots of meat. Like, maybe epidemiology is not good at proving certain things, but it's good at disproving certain hypotheses, or showing that they are pretty unlikely to hold up. And so it was also very interesting to see the results that the diabetics had. I think that's a very impressive thing, and I'm pretty excited for more clinical trials actually coming out the next years, because I think that's something that we need in order to shift the way of thinking a little bit. Because we, at least in my medical school, we do have some lectures on nutrition. I must admit, it's not a lot, but there is some, and it's all the same. It's all the nutrients are in plants. Meat is bad. It's bad for the environment. It's bad for cholesterol, blah blah. So it's like, it's still the same agenda. And I feel like Germany and Europe, it just follows the US, and so it just catches up a bit later. So we are now where you guys maybe have been a few years ago, and now it seems like there's this community growing, which come to understand that meat is an integral part of a healthy diet, and that's something that we should focus on. That's not the case here yet, but this might come in a few years, and I really hope that there is something to that there's more to come from these clinical trials, and that this might be applied later on as well.
Yeah, and I think, like I said, there are not, to be fair, there are very few studies on a carnivore diet, but
Exactly.
Every single one of the studies that's been done shows positive results, every single one of them. So the hypothesis should be that it is a healthy diet until proven otherwise. And because people will say, standard American diet, junk food diet has meat in it, and therefore meat is unhealthy. That is not a valid conclusion. When you have data on people on a carnivore diet and you see the exact opposite. So therefore, the more common sense thing would be, well, maybe it's the rest of the junk food diet that's the problem, not the meat. Again, we've been eating it for, as you know, as Rafi told you, we've been eating it for, 2-3 million years at
Right.
least. And so hopefully, like I said, as more clinical trials are done, there were three last year, three studies that came out last year that I'm aware of. Actually, I think there might have been four. Actually, I think there were 4 studies that came out last year on the carnivore diet. I suspect this year that there'll be more. I know we'll be spending quite a bit of money to do a couple more. So we're going to get data on that, and like I said, it's up to people to get the message out there and use that as leverage to push that, because I think most people, given the choice, would choose to eat meat.
Exactly.
Without all the massive brainwashing and propaganda that's being spent to convince people otherwise. The natural inclination is to, listen to our instincts.
Right. And I feel like people love to eat lots of meat. Like very many years ago, I was also one of these guys who was convinced of plants being the most important part of your diet. And I've been trying to cut out, not out, but to just to decrease the amount of meat I was eating. That was many years ago. But at the point where I realized that's probably not true, I realized how much I actually want to eat meat. Like, it's crazy, just the desire of animal products. That's pretty impressive. And so I think that's what many people, if they just start listening to that, they will realize how much the body actually asks for more meat and more animal products, because it's crucial, because it's very important to our body. So yeah, I think that's a very good statement to make here. So now, we've touched on so many things when it comes to this vegan propaganda and the myths regarding meat being unhealthy. I want before we start wrapping up, I just want to ask you a few quick, final questions about maybe you and some other things that I'm curious about. So you have kids, right? You're a father, and so many people are concerned about, I don't know, the diet for children, and they maybe even think that the diet for children has to be, in some sense, particularly different from the diet of adults. So just maybe give your take on what your children are eating and how you think what food we should give to our children in the most part.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's not that much different than adults in my view. I mean, I think kids need animal products. They need meat. Meat, is a staple for my kids' diet. They eat it pretty much every meal, or eggs or something like that. So that's something that I focus, make sure they get plenty of that. And then if they want to eat something beyond that, we start with whole foods, fruit, like for instance, our typical dinner around my household will be some sort of red meat, and there'll be usually some cheese cut up, and then there'll be 2 pieces of fruit. And that's what my kid will eat. For breakfast, he'll have eggs, and maybe he'll have some yogurt or something like that. And then for lunch, something similar. And that's how my kids do. I mean, they don't eat junk food to any significant degree. Every once in a while, I'll have some, but it's pretty rare. If you look in my closet, there's not, my cabinets, there's very little that's would be considered junk food, and so that's what I focus on. I think, getting high quality nutrition and making sure they get that from the beginning. They fill up on that. It's also easier as a parent, when you have kids, and one day, I don't know if you end up having children, they're a lot of work. And when you have to feed them every 30 minutes because they're constantly hungry, it makes your life a lot more difficult. And so I find that, Saturday morning, I'll cook them a giant breakfast of, eggs, and it might be steak, and it might be bacon, and there might be some cream in there. And I might make some waffles out of cheese and eggs, and I load them up on that. And then they're not hungry until dinner. I mean, I don't have to cook 6 times a day. It's very easy. I don't have to constantly hand out snacks. And so that is, kind of my strategy with my kids. And, like I said, I think they do pretty well with that, and they're pretty happy, and they're healthy, and they're not obese. They're very active and athletic. And I think all those things are important. I mean, when it comes to kids, feeding them is part of it, but also, encourage them to be healthy. And, the other thing is just, they're going to mimic what you do. And so what you do and demonstrate is something that it's going to rub off on your kids. Doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter what you tell them. They're not stupid. They're going to watch what you do. And if you don't walk the walk, they're not going to either.
Yeah, absolutely. And if they see what you do and they see that you're healthy and you're thriving and you're actually, your performance is on point and you're in great shape, and they see what you do in order to become that person who is in great shape and in such great health, then they will obviously try to copy you in that regard and also achieve these same results. So I think that's good advice, and we all understand kids grow, and so I think that's another reason to even better reason to actually focus even more on animal source food and protein, because that's exactly what they need in that age and time. And so yeah, I think it's also go ahead.
Let me just, if Max, let me just add a yeah, I was going to add there's a nice study that came out looking at optimal weaning patterns for mammals, and they looked at humans and other mammals, and they compared, because, obviously our first food is an animal product. It's milk, right? We're
Exactly.
mammals. So we start out for the first year, perhaps 2.5 years. If you look at an indigenous tribe, human beings typically wean at about 2 years of age. Now, modern life, we don't breastfeed as long, but in general, and then they look at the size of our brain relative to other mammals, and because we wean relatively early compared to, say, other primates like orangutans are breastfeeding for 8 years. Because of that, and because of the size of the brain, the only way that we could have developed our brain to the size that we have was by having a highly nutrient dense, calorically dense diet, and animal fat has a big role in that. And it's almost impossible to make that diet in the natural setting. Now, in the modern world, where you can hyper process food and you can grind up stuff into sugar and flour and powders and pack it in there, you can ramp up the amount of calories that are available. But in the natural world, it's hard to get enough calories from eating leaves to grow a human brain,
Absolutely.
particularly early on. So you need to have concentrated caloric amounts of food, and animal fat is many of the compounds within animal fat, the different fatty acids are very, very important for brain growth.
Yeah, absolutely. And I totally agree. And I think that's what people definitely should be thinking more about. And right, as you said, there's also lots of evidence to back that up. And it's again another just line of evidence that points to the fact that humans have been eating lots of animal fats and animal foods and meat, etc. And another thing that I was very curious about, that I've been thinking, I think you can be considered a quite controversial figure, because there's lots of people who love you and lots of people who absolutely hate you in the, vegan space, and, all these people that are just in disagreement with you. So, I'm very curious that this now has nothing to do with diet itself, but just I'm curious about how you, if there is lots of hate coming upon you, or if you had to do with lots of hate and actually disgust, point like people actually hating you for something or attacking you for things. I'm sure that has happened on many occasions. And my question to you is, how have you dealt with that? And has that actually happened on the street? Like you've been walking around and people were somehow looking at you in a weird way or attacking you somehow? And how's your reaction been to all that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say 99% of what I get, through social media, which is how most people interact with me, has been positive. I mean, I get constantly people telling me, "Thank you. We've improved our life. We've adopted some of the things you've been talking about." 1% or less is negativity, and usually it's some vegan saying, "I wish you die because you're an animal abuser," so on and so forth. Some nonsense. And I usually just laugh at that. It's
Right.
words. It doesn't bother me. I've never once in my entire life been confronted by anybody in a negative fashion. Most of the time, and sometimes I'm recognized in the street, people come up to me and we just have a little conversation. It's very pleasant, and most of them are supportive of what I do. I've been on stage and been on debates with other vegans who obviously disagree with what I say, and they've been very pleasant. No one's ever had a negative word to say. I mean, it helps maybe because I'm 6'5" and 115
You're
kilos.
hard to kill, right?
Yeah, I'm hard to kill. But I've never had anybody in real life actually do anything negative to me, and so I assume, I think social media represents a very small microcosm of reality, and many people feel, due to anonymity and the fact that you're not in the room, they can say whatever they want, stuff they would never actually say in person. And I think we're all, sort of subject to that. I try to, I generally, I'm very, I don't try to hide behind a false identity. I'm who I am. I'm pretty transparent about where I am, and where I come from, is what my beliefs are. And so I've been pretty consistent with that, whether it's on social media, whether it's on I mean, sometimes some aspects of social media, like say for Twitter, you're limited to a small amount of characters. So it's tough to get in nuance and a developed conversation. Whereas in a place like this where we can talk and stuff like that, most people realize I'm a reasonable guy. I'm not
Exactly.
a zealot.
That's what I meant.
I'm just trying to figure out what's helpful for people. And at the end of the day, I help people. And I mean, that should be good enough. I mean, it's like, hey, the guy's helping people, let him do his thing. And if I disagree, I disagree. But at the end of the day, results are all that really matters to me.
I absolutely agree with that. And I really acknowledge you for, constantly like still showing up and doing your best to fight in some sense for what you believe for, because it clearly helps people. And I think that's what counts. And that you stand behind that, and that you continue to stand behind what is true and what you see makes people happier and healthier. I think that's the most important thing. And even if people disagree with you in some sense, or if they disagree on the science that you cite or whatever, I think everyone must still applaud you for what you do, because it's helping people, it's making people healthier, and that's what counts. And that's actually the best thing, yeah, that you can expect from a human being, because it's just great. Like it's the thing that people look for. They look for meaning. They look for, what can I actually do in life? Life is meaningless. I don't, I can't do anything. But hey, if you look for ways how you can improve people's life, that's the best thing you might be looking for when it comes to a meaningful life. And that's what you do. And that's what I want to make everyone think about that, and acknowledge you for actually doing all that. It's really, really great thing.
Well, thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Exactly. So again, it's been awesome. I think we've covered very, very much in that conversation. And I'm having one final question for you, which I ask at the end of every podcast, which has, most of the time nothing to do with the actual topic that we've been discussing. And the question is, what keeps you going in hard times? So let me explain maybe for a second. Imagine that you stand in front of a very difficult situation, and that you have something currently happening in your life, which is very overwhelming. Maybe it's even, the craziness that's going on right now in the world, which, we haven't really been talking about that today, which I don't know if that's good or bad. Everyone can decide on his or her own. But imagine you're standing in front of a very difficult task. You feel overwhelmed. You're about to give up, but you still keep going. So what is the thing that keeps you going in that moment? It might be a person. It might be an event, a memory, anything. Where you say, okay, no, I'm not giving up. I'm actually pushing through and actually continue to go this path.
Well, I mean, what keeps us going? I mean, we're all human beings. We want to be alive. I mean, that's number one. I mean, we all have an innate drive to all living creatures want to live as long as possible and function as long as possible. So I think that's an innate thing. I mean, I think for me, I have sort of been in really tough situations physically, with sport, with stressful situations. And, I've come out the other side. So, I mean, the history of being successful in navigating these things keeps me, going. I've certainly had setbacks, and I've had negative things happen to me. But at the end of the day, I mean, that's just life, and you just have to.
Right.
I mean, I think we just have to. We don't have a choice. I mean, it's either that or, and I do think, there are a number of people. I saw this interesting quote that human beings are the only creatures that, diet 25 and don't get buried till 75. And so a lot of
Awesome.
us check out
Yes.
of life and just exist. But I think that's not, I don't think anybody wants that. And so I think part of that is it comes down to fundamentally being healthy in both mind, spirit, and body. And when you have those things, and I think nutrition plays a big role in this, then life is, you want to participate in life. You don't want to be a spectator. And so, whatever adversity is coming on, and like I mentioned, I'm doing jujitsu now, and it's a very interesting dynamic, because when I go there, I'm literally fighting for my life.
Right.
Somebody is trying to choke me to death. Or simulating that, and it's a very, very stressful situation. And I'm literally fighting to stay alive, several times a week. And so it makes everything else relatively seem less stressful. And so I think some of that helps to put yourself in that type of situation. But again, having a background of good health, good mental health, good physical health, and then having people around you that you care about, all those things are going to make you want to continue to strive and press on and push through any adversity you might change. Because it's guaranteed. You're going to have stuff. You're going to have things that don't work well in your favor, and you're going to be under stress and pressure, and bad things are going to happen to you. It happens to all of us, and
Exactly.
you either choose to overcome that, or you define yourself by that. And I think most of us would rather overcome.
Yeah, awesome. I think that's great advice, and I think a lot of what you have mentioned comes from the mentality that you acquired through your journey of exercising and working out. Because as you said, you're the guy, you're pushing through workouts. You're having these fights in jiu-jitsu, and and then working out is such a fascinating thing, because you have these ups and downs, and you have these setbacks, and you have progress then, and you fail and still get up and try again, and you push through this workout, even if it's super difficult and exhausting. And so if you have that mentality, then whatever, as you said, whatever comes and whatever happens, you say, okay, that's less stressful than what I have already encountered in my life. And so I think that's great advice what people can actually take and try to implement in their lives. So thank you for that. Well,
all right. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Dr. Shawn, it's been a pleasure. Please tell people where they can find you and maybe learn more about what you do and maybe support you as well. So where can people go?
Yeah, the best place to find me is, because I'm there every day, and you can talk to me on Zoom call if you want. It's rivero.com. That's our company. You can join for free and be a participant in our meetings in the morning. Well, I guess in Germany, that would be whatever time it is now, a little bit earlier, 9 a.m. Pacific time. I have a YouTube channel, Shawn Baker, MD. I'm on Instagram at Shawn Baker 1967, SHAWNBAKER 1967. I'm on Twitter at SBakerMD. And I think that's pretty much it. That's where I'm at.
You actually co-host a podcast together with Zach Bitter, right?
I used to do a podcast with Zach called the Human Performance Outliers Podcast, right? Zach, and I haven't done that in about 2 years. So now I do just the Rivero podcast. And so we have, like I said, I'm going to be interviewing, various people. I talked to Ted Naiman on Friday, I think, or Saturday. So yeah, I do Rivero. So if you go to rivero.com, you can get our podcast, or go to Rivero YouTube page and you can see our podcast as well.
Awesome. Again, Dr. Shawn Baker, it's been an awesome conversation, and thanks so much for continuing to help people, for showing up, and for having that conversation with me today.
Thanks very much. Okay, take care. We'll see you later. Bye-bye.